came in the sailing season, when the sea is kind, and they drew the ships up onto the sand rather than leaving them at anchor. That is worth pausing on, because it tells you what kind of story this is going to be. A fleet at anchor is a fleet that may leave in the night. A fleet hauled out of the water, keel first, hull resting on rollers of cut timber, propped upright with posts driven into the sand. That is a fleet that has decided to stay a while. There were a great many of them. The old catalog lists the contingents by their harbors and their captains, and reading it is a little like reading a list of villages, which is what they were. Men from stony islands, men from grain country, men from places whose names have long since stopped meaning anything to anyone. They came because their kings had sworn an oath years before, and the oath had come due, and a woman named Helen had gone to Troy. That is the whole of the beginning, and the poems do not spend much longer on it than that. What they built on the beach was not a camp in the way you might picture a camp. It became a town. It had streets, eventually, worn into the sand by 10 years of the same men walking the same way to the same places. It had a wall on the landward side and a ditch in front of the wall, thrown up out of the same sand, and stakes set into the ditch. It had an assembly ground where the men gathered to hear things argued out, and a stretch of beach where they raced, and a place where the smiths worked, and a place where the fires were. At dusk, you would see those fires from a long way off. Hundreds of them, low and orange along the curve of the shore, each one with its handful of men around it, and the smoke going up straight or sideways, depending on the wind off the water. The sound of it would have been enormous, and also somehow soft. Thousands of voices at a distance turning into a single low sound, the way a river does. Behind them, the sea. In front of them, a flat plain with 2 rivers running across it, and beyond the plain, a hill, and on the hill, a city with walls. They could see the city from the beach. That is the detail that makes the 10 years make sense. Every morning for 10 years, the men on the beach woke and looked up, and there it was, close enough to see the towers, close enough to see smoke rising from inside it, and they could not get in. And every morning for 10 years, the people on the walls looked down and saw the ships and the fires and the smoke of the camp, and could not make them go. 2 settlements, then, within sight of one another, neither able to move the other. That is not a battle. That is a very long, very patient arrangement. And everything else in this story grows out of it. The first ships came ashore in spring. Nobody who dragged a keel up that sand expected to still be there when the 10th winter came. The city had walls that people said had been built by gods, which is the sort of thing people say about walls that have never been broken. They were high and they were sloped at the base, so that a man trying to climb them found the stone leaning out over him, and they had towers set along them and gates. Inside, it was a city like other cities. That is easy to forget, because the story is told mostly from the beach, and from the beach, a city is just a shape. But inside, there were streets that went up the hill in terraces, and houses with courtyards and wells, and the smell of bread and of animals and of the smoke from cooking fires. There were temples at the top. There were storerooms with grain in them, which mattered more than anyone in the songs likes to admit, because a siege is finally an argument about storerooms. There was a king who was very old. He had many sons. The songs are fond of the number 50, which probably means only asterisk more than anyone could easily count. The eldest of those sons who mattered was Hector, and Hector had a wife, and the wife had a loom. The loom is the thing to hold on to. In an upper room, with a window that looked out over the plain, a woman worked at a standing loom, and the weight stones on the warp threads clicked softly against each other whenever she moved the shed. Weaving is slow. It is the slowest useful thing a person can do with their hands. You put in a thread and beat it up against the threads above it and put in another. A hand's width of cloth is a morning. A cloak is a season. And while she wove, out on on the plain below the window, the war was happening. Not constantly. That is another thing the songs compress. Mostly the plain was empty. Mostly there were men cutting fodder and driving cattle and carrying water, and the two armies stayed where they were. But sometimes the gates opened and the men went down, and sometimes they came back, and sometimes they did not. And the woman at the loom would hear it before she saw it, because a city hears things. She wove flowers into the cloth. The poem says so, and says it at exactly the moment it will hurt the most, which is the sort of thing that poem does. But we are not going there tonight. Tonight, it is simply an upper room with the shutters half open and the light coming in low and yellow off the plain, and the small dry clicking of loom weights over and over for 10 years. Down in the streets, the lamps were being lit. Small clay lamps with a wick floating in oil, set in a niche by a doorway, and each one making a soft circle of light on the stone about as wide as a person. From the beach at night, the city would have looked like a hill with a scattering of stars laid onto it. From the city, the beach looked like the same thing. Hundreds of fires, 2 constellations looking at each other across a plain for 10 years, waiting to see which one would go out. Here is what the songs leave out, and what this chapter is for. 9 years pass. The whole of the great poem takes place inside a few weeks of the 10th year. Everything before that, 9 full turnings of the seasons, 9 sets of winter rains, 9 springs when the plain went green again, is summarized in a line here and a line there, the way you might summarize a decade of your own life in a sentence at a party. But those years happened. Somebody lived every one of those mornings. So what did they do? They foraged. An army that size cannot be fed from ships. They went up and down the coast and inland to the smaller towns and took cattle and grain, and sometimes traded for it, and sometimes did not. They raided the islands. They spent, by one accounting, far more of that decade on the water and in other people's fields than they ever spent in front of Troy. They farmed a little. 10 years is long enough that men who know how to put seed in the ground will put seed in the ground. They repaired things. Ships hauled out on a beach for a decade do not stay seaworthy on their own. Timber rots at the waterline. Ropes go. Sails need resewing. There would have been men whose entire war was maintenance, recocking seams, replacing thole pins, keeping several hundred hulls just barely capable of one day going home. They got sick. The poem opens with a plague in the camp, and a plague in a camp is not a supernatural event. It is what happens when tens of thousands of people live on a beach with no drains for 10 years. They gambled and argued and made friends. They developed opinions about each other that lasted the rest of their lives. And the seasons went round. In autumn, the 2 rivers on the plain rose, and the flat ground between the city and the sea turned to gray mud, and nothing at all could happen for weeks except waiting. In winter, the wind came off the water, and the men slept close to the fires and pulled cloaks over their heads. In spring, the plain went green, and the cattle were driven down to the river to drink, and it looked, briefly, like ordinary country. In summer, the dust came up 10 times over. That is the war. There is a strange comfort in this, and it is the reason this chapter exists. We think of the Trojan War as 10 years of shouting and bronze. It was mostly 10 years of weather. It was men waiting and being bored and doing the small maintaining work that keeps a large number of people alive in one place and looking up at a hill. The great and terrible parts of the story are real. They are also about 3 weeks long. Everything else was the rain coming across the plain from the sea, and somebody saying again that they thought it would clear by evening. In the 10th year, there was a quarrel about honor, and because of it, the best fighter in the camp stopped fighting. That is the whole engine of the poem, and it is worth saying plainly because it sounds small. It was small. 2 men wanted the same thing, and the one with more authority took it from the one with more skill, and the one with more skill decided that if his worth was not going to be acknowledged, then he would simply stop demonstrating it. His name was Achilles. He led a contingent from the north, a few thousand men, and he had a reputation that had arrived at Troy before he did. What he did was go to his tent and stay there. It is such an ordinary form of anger, not a rage that breaks things, a withdrawal. He kept his men out of the fighting, and he sat in his shelter by the ships at the far end of the beach, and he waited to be asked properly. The poem at one point shows us what he was doing in there. He was playing a lyre. He had taken it as spoil from a city somewhere, and he sat and played it and sang to himself about the deeds of famous men. And his closest companion sat opposite him in silence, waiting for him to finish. That is one of the quietest images in all of Greek epic, and it sits directly in the middle of the most famous war story ever told. A young man in a tent by the sea, singing softly, sulking, with a friend sitting patiently across from him. Outside, the war went on without him and went badly. Inside, nothing happened for a long time. He walked sometimes at the edge of the water. The poem has him do this more than once. Go out alone to where the gray sea came up the sand and look at it and speak to it. His mother was of the sea in the old telling, and so the water was a place he went to be heard. Whether you take that literally or not, the picture is the same, and it is very human. A man walking on a beach at the far edge of an encampment, out past the last of the fires, saying things aloud to open water, because there is nobody else to say them to. The ships at that end of the beach had been out of the water so long that grass had started at their keels. They sat propped and quiet in the dark, huge, useless, pointed at a sea nobody was crossing. And the days went on, and the messages came, and he refused them. And the fighting on the plain got worse, and he did not come out. Sometimes a story turns on somebody doing a great thing. This one turns on somebody declining to. for a while, in the 10th year of a 10-year war, the loudest thing on that whole beach was one tent where a man was not doing anything at all. So they sent men to ask him. It happened at night, which is the first good thing about this scene. 3 of them walked the length of the camp in the dark, along the shore, past the fires of the other contingents, out towards the far end where the northern ships were drawn up. Nobody in the poem says much on the walk. They go along the edge of the sea, and the sea is loud, and they are rehearsing in their heads what they are going to say. They found him doing exactly what he had been doing, sitting with the lyre, playing with his companion opposite. And here is the second good thing about this scene, and the reason it belongs in a sleep story. He saw them coming, and he got up, and he was glad to see them. And before a single word of business was spoken, he fed them. This is not sentiment. It is procedure. In that world, a guest arriving at your door is owed a meal before anyone is permitted to ask why they came. And the poem, which is in the middle of describing a catastrophe, stops completely and describes the meal in full. It tells you who cut the meat and how the fire was let to burn down to embers first, because you cannot cook over flame. It tells you that the fat was sprinkled with salt. It tells you the bread was set out in baskets. It tells you who poured and where each man sat. Read it slowly, and it is barely a war poem at all. It is 4 men and a fire on a beach at night, cooking in the middle of the 10th year of a siege, being extremely careful with each other. Then they asked, and he said no. They offered him a great deal: land, treasure, restitution, an apology of sorts delivered by proxy. He listened to all of it and answered at length. And the answer was the most modern thing in the poem: that no quantity of goods is the same as being valued, and that a life cannot be traded for objects, because you can win back cattle and tripods, but you cannot win back a life once it is spent. He said he would sail home in the morning. He did not sail home in the morning, but that night he meant it. And then, and this is where the chapter ends, because it is the perfect place, they made up beds for the guests. The poem says so. It lists the bedding: fleeces, a rug, a linen sheet, a woolen blanket laid over the top. One of the older men stayed and slept there in the shelter, and the others walked back along the dark beach the way they had come. The fire went down to embers. The sea kept doing what it does. Nothing had been solved. Everybody slept anyway. On the other side of the plain, earlier, there had been a conversation at a gate. Hector had come up into the city during a lull, dusty, carrying his helmet, on an errand about offerings at the temple, and had gone looking for his wife and not found her at home. The servants told him she had gone up to the tower because she had heard the fighting was going badly and she wanted to see. He turned around and went back down through the streets he had just come up, and he met her at the great gate on the way out, coming the other way, with a nurse carrying their small son. That is the entire scene. A man and a woman meeting by accident in a gateway, because each had gone to find the other, and they took different streets. What they said to each other is one of the oldest recorded conversations between a husband and a wife, and most of it is her asking him not to go back out, and him explaining gently and without much conviction why he is going too. But the part everyone remembers is not the argument. It is the child. He reached out to take the boy, and the boy screamed and turned away and buried his face in the nurse's shoulder because he did not recognize his father under the bronze, and because the horsehair crest on the helmet was nodding at him from above, and it was frightening. And both parents laughed. Then Hector took the helmet off and put it down on the ground, where it lay and shone, and picked up his son, who was fine now, and held him. That is it. That is the whole of it. A frightening object set down on the flagstones, and a family standing in a gateway in the late afternoon, laughing at a baby. There is a well in the courtyard behind them, and women coming to it with jars, because it is evening, and that is when water is fetched. There is wind along the top of the wall, the kind that comes off a plane all day and drops at dusk. There are swallows. He gave the boy back. He said the sorts of things people say. He picked the helmet up again and put it on and went down through the gate, and she went home. And the poem is very precise about this. She kept turning round to look back at him as she walked. We are going to leave them there. You know what happens. Everybody who has ever heard of Troy knows what happens. But knowing is not the same as being shown. And tonight, nobody is going to be shown anything. Tonight it is a gateway in the evening, and a helmet lying on the stones with a light on it, and two people who have just laughed at the same thing at the same time, which is most of what a marriage is. The gate stayed open a while longer. The women filled their jars. The wind went down as it always did, and the swallows came out over the wall. Later, after the worst of it, after everything the earlier chapters walked around, there was a night that the poem chooses to end on, and it ends on it for a reason. An old man came out of the city at night, alone except for one driver and a wagon, and crossed the plain and went into the camp of the enemy and asked for his son's body back. He was the king. He was very old. He had come out through his own gate, past his own people begging him not to, and driven across ground where nothing good had happened for 10 years, and gone in among tens of thousands of men who had spent a decade trying to get into his city, and he had done it because a body is a body, and it needed to be buried. And he found the young man's shelter and went in and knelt down and did a thing the poem clearly regards as almost unbearable. He took the hand of the man who had killed his son and kissed it and asked him to think of his own father. And the young man wept, and the old man wept, and they wept for different people in the same room at the same time, one for a son, one for a father he was never going to see again. And then it passed, the way weeping does, and they got up. Here is what happens next, and it is the reason this is the last real chapter. He fed him. Of course he did. the same procedure as before. A sheep was killed and dressed and roasted, and bread was set out in baskets, and they sat down opposite each other and ate. Neither of them had eaten properly in days. The poem makes a point of it, and makes a point of the fact that grief has to be interrupted for meals, that even the worst of it stops for supper. And when they had eaten, they looked at each other. The poem says this outright, with a kind of wonder, each of them struck by how the other looked. The old man at the young man's size and beauty, the young man at the old man's dignity. Then the body was washed and covered with cloths that had been brought from the city as a ransom, good cloth, folded, the sort a household keeps for a lifetime and gives away once, and laid on the wagon. And then, because it was very late, they made up a bed for the old king outside the shelter, in the porch, where he would not be seen. Fleeces and blankets again, listed again. And it says, and this is the line, that they slept, the old man and his driver on the porch, and the young man inside with his companion beside him. Everyone in that scene had lost the thing they cared about most. Nothing was fixed. The war was not over, and would not be over, and would end in the way everybody already knew it would end. They ate, and they were kind to each other for one evening, and then they slept. There is no better ending than that, and the poem knows it and stops there. The horse is not in the poem at all. That surprises people. The single most famous object in the story, the one thing everybody can draw, belongs to other, later tellings, mentioned in passing in a song within a song, filled in centuries afterwards by other poets. The great poem ends with a funeral and does not go on. But since we have come this far, we can walk the last part slowly, and we can walk it the way a carpenter would. It was, whatever else it was, a piece of joinery. Somebody had to build it. That means felling timber, fir, the old accounts say, and hauling it, and seasoning what could not be used green, and shaping it, and pegging it, because there were no nails worth the name. It means a frame, and planking over the frame, and a hatch cut into the belly with a ladder ladder inside, and the whole thing raised on some sort of base, and the base put on rollers because it had to be moved. It was, in other words, a boat builder's problem, and that camp had been maintaining several hundred hulls on a beach for 10 years. If there was one skill that Army had in surplus by the 10th year, it was carpentry. So picture the last few nights of it. Not a stratagem, a workshop. Men on the sand with adzes and augers, working by firelight, curved planks steaming. Someone complaining about the grain of a piece of fur. And then the morning. The thing everybody forgets about that morning is the emptiness. The fires were out. The tents were gone, struck, burned, or loaded. The ships that had sat propped and grass grown on that beach for 10 years had been put back into the water and were gone over the horizon, and the beach where a town had stood was just a beach again. 10 years of habitation, and by dawn there was nothing there but ash rings in the sand and post holes and the ruts where the keels had been dragged down, and gulls walking about in it looking for whatever had been dropped. And on the walls, people looking down at that. Imagine being one of them. 10 years. Every single morning of your adult life, you have got up and looked out, and there have been fires on the beach. And this morning, there is nothing. The plain is empty, and the sea is empty, and the wind is coming off the water the way it does. And the great gates are standing open in the mist for the first time in a decade. And people are walking out onto the plain, out past the ditch, down to the shore, just to stand on it. We are going to stop there, not because of what happens next, but because that is genuinely where the quiet is. An empty beach at first light, gulls on the sand, a gate standing open, and a great many tired people walking out onto flat ground in the early morning to see for themselves that the ships had really gone. The story goes on. It always goes on. It goes on for another 500 years in other people's poems, and the survivors of it end up founding cities and haunting islands and giving their names to things. But not tonight. Tonight we leave them on the sand in the mist, and the sea going in and out on a long, shallow beach, the way it had done all the way through, the whole 10 years, every night, whether anybody was listening or not. The tide comes up the flat sand and goes back down again, and it will keep doing that. Nothing else is going to happen now. The plain is empty, and the wind has dropped, and there is only the water arriving and leaving on a very long and very shallow beach, under a sky that is slowly getting darker. Sleep well,